Thank you, Olivia, and a big thank you to Social Innovation Summit for providing me the opportunity to talk about such an important topic. Before I get started, I want to note that the views that I will be discussing today are my own and do not necessarily reflect that of the employer, my employer, or the event organizers. I want to start off by telling you a story of a close friend of mine who came to me for advice about a serious medical issue. It started off with just intermittent abdominal pain that gradually started to worsen. My friend went to see her primary care physician. The primary care physician ordered basic blood work, and those blood work came back negative. There was no reason to suspect a serious diagnosis. She was young, healthy, and living life to the fullest. With this news, she went on to her planned trip to Florida with her family. She had to cut her trip short. The pain became unbearable. It woke her up in the middle of the night. And this time, her primary care physician ordered imaging studies. And the imaging studies confirmed a horrible diagnosis of metastatic pancreatic cancer. She was referred to an oncologist. Back then, and even now, metastatic pancreatic cancer still has limited treatments. With that, my friend came to me for advice about next steps. To me, the answer was obvious: enroll in a clinical study. In fact, there were some local ones that were open, and she could enroll immediately. However, my friend was hesitant. She wondered, why didn't her oncologist bring up the option of a clinical trial? Would she be a guinea pig for academic centers and pharmaceutical industries? What if she got placebo and then it would all be a waste of time? I explained to her that's not how it worked. Generally, oncology studies do not use placebo. And clinical trials are the most advanced science or technology that we can use in patients who have limited options. But sadly, my friend was still reluctant. She proceeded to undergo natural homeopathic medicines instead of enrolling in a clinical trial. Approximately 6 to 8 months, she complained of chest pain, went into the hospital, arrested, and died. So what is a clinical trial? In the most basic definition, a clinical trial is a study performed on people to investigate a medical, surgical, or behavior intervention. It's how we learn or how we find out cutting-edge therapies that will be safe and effective in people, in humans. Why should you care about a clinical trial? Well, have you had a loved one or even yourself been diagnosed with diabetes, hypertension, or maybe a loved one with Alzheimer's disease? Then maybe you should care. One of the benefits of enrolling in a clinical trial is that maybe you or your loved one will be the first one to gain access to cutting-edge therapy before it is widely distributed. Clinical trials are a key, crucial way that we move science and medicine forward. So what I want to talk to you about today And what this story, my friend's story, illustrates is the general lack of participation in clinical trials. But more specifically, what I want to talk about today is the lack of diversity in clinical trials and what you and I can do so that people like my friend and others can partake in such important studies. With that being said, it is important to acknowledge that clinical trial diversity is not a political topic. It is simply solid, good science. It goes beyond that reluctant single patient. It's an entire ecosystem that needs to change. And it's not just the Black community that is underrepresented in clinical trials. Our Asian community, our Native American community are also highly unrepresented in clinical trials in this country. In fact, women are also underrepresented in certain clinical trials. While race is a social and not a biological construct, it is well documented that certain populations have different effects or metabolize drugs differently. And this is most likely due to genetic variation. But until we can understand and meaningfully use genetic variations, we must include race as a variable in our clinical trials. And if we are going to include race as a variable in our clinical trials, we need to diversify our studies more. So why is this challenge elusive? Well, for starters, as pointed out in the story about my friend, there's a great mistrust between the healthcare system and communities of color due to many years of wrongdoing in the past. There are several other reasons why clinical trials are not diverse today. However, I'm going to touch on just several here, just a couple here. Another reason is that our clinical research institutions are not located where communities of color live and work. Some of our communities of color are not able to afford to take time off from work or pay for childcare. And the last one I'll mention today is enrollment criteria. Some in our communities of color have multiple illnesses or comorbidities. And those illnesses or comorbidities disqualify them from entering into our studies. So we know the problems now, but how do we solve for them? How do we, especially those of us in biopharma and biotech, make clinical trials more accessible and more inclusive? And for those of you who are not working in biopharma, where can you feel inspired to make space for diverse populations in your spheres of influence? We need to design, recruit, and enroll our clinical trials to reflect real-world distribution of the disease. For example, Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a devastating progressive disease with limited treatment options. Black people are 2 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than their white counterparts. But in general, Black people are nearly absent in clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease. We are failing to bring our patients into the discussions about clinical trials. Therefore, change not only needs to happen at the industry level, but also at the doctor's offices. We need to increase research into racial differences in disease manifestations and understanding how socioeconomics, behavior, genetic ancestry, and other factors come into play. We need to engage, provide, and build a culture of including our Black institutions, such as the Meharry in Nashville, Tennessee, the Howards in Washington, D.C. And we need to make a dedicated industry-wide investment in training our young Black physicians to conduct clinical trials, while at the same time, we educate all investigators on how important clinical diversity is in clinical trials. At Horizon, we have started the discussion, the dialogue on clinical trial diversity, and we've initiated some small steps in our studies. For one, we're asking all our research teams to be mindful and to outline a plan on how they plan to recruit and enroll real world, to reflect the real world distribution of a disease. We've developed a patient advocacy group who works with our communities of color. We've ensured that all our patient education material is both in English and in Spanish. We also look forward to partnering on making investments on training young Black physicians to conduct clinical trials. By pursuing such goals, our society can start to address the inequality that has plagued clinical research and scientific research for decades. But this is only the beginning. I welcome conversations and discussions surrounding racial disparities in healthcare among my biotech, biopharma colleagues, government agencies, and the private sector. I invite you to help the health community to influence a new understanding on the value of clinical trials. Thank you for your attention today, and I hope you have a productive and enjoyable rest of the summit.